Hi again. Kenneth Scott Latourette, page 244 of A History of Christianity, dealing with Christians and public amusements in the early centuries, and also Christians and slavery. On amusements, Christians also set themselves against the prevailing mores of Greco-Roman life. The theatre, gladiatorial combats, and contests between men and beasts were almost universal. Every city of consequence had prominent structures for them. The pagan emperors, even such noble spirits among them as Marcus Aurelius, considered it part of their public duty to give gladiatorial shows and to attend them, and the crowd demanded them. Yet leading Christians unhesitatingly condemned the theatre and the sports of the amphitheatre. The theatre was opposed because of the lewdness of its plays and its hypocrisy, its simulation of love, wrath, fear, and sorrow. Tertullian gave as reasons for the prohibition to Christians of attendance at the public spectacles the fact that the games and the gladiatorial contests were in honor of the pagan gods, that they stirred up rage, bitterness, and grief, that the accompanying betting was too agitating to be wholesome, and that through them crime was not only committed but also taught. Another of the early Christian writers denounced the gladiatorial shows as a cannibal banquet for the soul, and still another as inculcating murder. Some, including Clement of Alexandria, forbade Christians to frequent the racecourse. Hippolytus declared that early Christian tradition did not countenance attending or taking part in chariot races. Augustine described and condemned the bloodlust aroused by witnessing the gladiatorial combats. For a time, the church refused baptism to a professional gladiator unless he would renounce that occupation, and excluded from the communion those who frequented the games. Under the influence of his new faith, the Emperor Constantine forbade gladiatorial shows and abolished the legal penalties which required criminals to become gladiators. John Chrysostom, like many a lesser bishop and preacher, took up the verbal cudgels against horse racing, popular farces, and pantomimes. Yet these amusements were continued even after the majority of the population of the empire had become professed Christians, and when many, perhaps most of their patrons bore the Christian name. We are told that the gladiatorial combats persisted in Rome until, in the 5th century, a monk, Telemachus, leapt into the arena to stop the combatants, and the mob, presumably nominally Christian, stoned him to death for interfering with their pleasure. Thereupon the emperor ordered that the spectacles be stopped, and Telemachus enrolled among the martyrs. Probably, however, the end of the gladiatorial combats and of contests in the arena between men and beasts was due as much to the growing poverty of the declining empire and the dearth of recruits for the ranks of the gladiators as to the Christian conscience. And now the Christians in slavery. Christians carried on no organized campaign against slavery. That was to wait until the 19th and 20th centuries. Yet here also, although by no means so markedly as in the case of amusements, the trend of the Christian conscience and of Christian practice was against a basic, generally accepted institution of the Greco-Roman world and mitigated its harshness. Even the casual student of Greco-Roman culture cannot be but aware of the prominence in it of slavery. The Greek democracies had slavery, and the leisure of their free citizens for the affairs of the state was made possible by the labor of slaves. In the Roman Empire, the great landed estates were worked by slaves, and slaves also did much of the urban labor and performed most of the domestic service in households which could afford them. The lot of the slaves was often unhappy, and public opinion condoned the use of the lash on them, the killing of them when their usefulness was past, and the selling of them at low price when they became old. Few Christians condemned slavery outright. Many Christians owned slaves, and some Christian masters treated their slaves harshly. Yet, Christian teaching ameliorated the lot of slaves. While Paul commanded slaves to obey their masters as slaves of Christ, doing their work as unto him, that is the Lord, not unto men, he also exhorted masters to forbear threatening their slaves, remembering that there is no respect of persons with him who is in heaven. the master of both earthly masters and slaves. In a very touching letter, Paul returned a fugitive slave to his master, pleading with the latter to receive the runaway as a brother in the Lord. Paul also declared that in the Christian fellowship there is neither bond nor free, but that all are one in Christ Jesus. More than once in later centuries, Christian writers reminded those of their faith that in God's sight the master has no higher status than the slave, but that both are to be judged. Ambrose said that the slave might be superior in character to his master and be really more free than he. Augustine declared that God did not create rational man to lord it over his fellow creatures or his rational fellows. In this attitude, both Ambrose and Augustine may have been influenced by Stoicism, but they believed it to be in accord with Christian principles. In many places, slaves might hold office in the church. It was not unusual for pagans to free their slaves, but many Christians did likewise. That they believed that a connection existed between their faith and this act is seen from the fact that manumission was often solemnized in a church and on one of the great festival days, especially Easter. Near the end of the 1st century, we hear of Christians who voluntarily became slaves to ransom others from bondage. Christianity undercut slavery by giving dignity to work, no matter how seemingly menial that might be. Traditionally, labor which might be performed by slaves was despised as degrading to the free man. Christian teachers said that all should work and that labor should be done as to Christ, as master, and as to God, and in the sight of God. Work became a Christian duty. Before the end of the 5th century, slavery was declining. This was not due entirely, and perhaps not even chiefly, to the influence of Christianity, but the latter contributed to it. I'll put in a link to 2 views of slavery back in the days of the Civil War. See you soon.